If you're here in this stream at the moment, you are here for the Te Tiriti and SDGs panel. If you want to participate in the Growing Sustainable Culture in your organisation workshop, you need to jump into the link in the chat. And so this panel is really where we're going to try and delve into the topic of partnerships as expressed through SDG 17 in relation to Te Tiriti or Waitangi as being the foundational document of Aotearoa New Zealand, as well as the application of the treaty in modern society, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with the 3 Ps, protection, participation, and partnership, which funnily enough is what we're here to talk about. And so hopefully we'll have a good wānanga with our panelists and get a bit of a glimpse into the understanding of how Te Tiriti may be viewed and expressed for all of us in relation to the SDGs, and in particular from a kaupapa Māori paradigm. And so exploring examples of good practice, elaborate on some of the difficulties encountered with the SDGs and perhaps the treaty, and some suggested ways in which we can approach being transformational through relational politics. And so we've got another lineup of 3 fantastic speakers, Sasha McMeekin, Norm Hill, and Moko Morris. And we're not quite as possibly prepared as the previous panel. And so the way in which I've decided we're going to run this panel is we'll give each of our speakers up to 10 minutes to share their views on the SDGs, Te Tiriti, and this notion of partnership and where some of the synergies may be for the SDGs and Te Tiriti, as well as what some of the difficulties might be. And so we'll go in that order that I just went through before, Sasha, Norm, and then Moko. And if any of our panelists have an issue with that, aroha mai, nāku kia te he. Hioi, hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end for some questions as well. So again, to our panelists, you've got about up to 10 minutes. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sasha, one of my whanaukā, and also a colleague here at UC. Sasha's the head of school at Aotearoa School of Māori and Indigenous Studies. And among other things, she's the Maui Lab co-director and co-director of Tokona Te Raki, the Māori Futures Academy. And so, kei te tuahine, kei te whanaunga, kei a koe te wā.
Tēnā koutou, e rere ana ngā mihi kia koutou, kia koe te tēnane, ka nei te mihi aroha. It's lovely to be with you all tonight. Although it does feel quite late to have long sentences and insightful contributions, but I will do my best. I don't have any slides, so you'll have to endure the full-size screen, which is again not the best thing at this time of night. But more problematic potentially in this audience is that I'm not sure I'm actually a fan of the SDGs. Which could get me ejected quite quickly. And so I want to talk to that in 2 parts. First, about locating the SDGs in a big picture and their whakapapa of where they've come from, and then more specifically to look at the relationship between the treaty and the SDGs. So I think when we look at the SDGs, they are a continuation of the development of our international human rights instruments, but they're a continuation of those instruments of a very different character, which I think has got real significance for how we could and should potentially view the SDGs. So when we look at human rights, they were about articulating the conditions that were deemed necessary minimum standards for human dignity to flourish. And in their nature, our human rights instruments are designed to be protectors and of points of principle, whereas the SDGs are about pragmatism. They're about doing concrete actions that make real change. And I think inside Māori communities, we've always had a tension between the point of principle and the pragmatic outcome that we're looking for. So in terms of my own personal views on the SDGs, I'm torn between valuing pragmatism that mobilises action and feeling lonely for privileging points of principle in the conversation. And I think that tension about principle and pragmatism is also where some of the complexity about their relationship with the treaty comes in, because the treaty is fundamentally about principle. What are the base principles on which we endeavoured to found our nation, irrespective of how history might have transpired. But then we all know that those principles have been obscured and there is instead entrenched disadvantage. So we need pragmatism, but I think we always need to be careful with our pragmatism that it has a fidelity to the originating points of principle. And to be fair, the SDGs do correlate to our human rights standards, and importantly, they develop on them, particularly in respect of protections or the poverty alleviation that advances on what exists internationally in that, and the protection of economic rights, which is quite skeletal. So they're valuable, but then I think comes the next difficulty and the whakapapa of the SDGs, which is the recent obsession with indicators. So when we look at the SDG indicators, they bear a really strong relationship with the indicators that exist in the OECD's wellbeing framework, and then more locally in our own living standards framework. And we all know that what gets measured is inevitably what gets prioritised and focused on. But the type of indicators that we've got in the SDG space have got the same obsession with objective and quantifiable indicators that every other indicator framework does, which is not necessarily what matters to humans. Some of the I've forgotten his name, which is very bad for an academic, but there's one of the main wellbeing indicator commentators says that we've got the ability to measure anything and have absolutely no insight into whether citizens are happy and content. And that comes from that if we're measuring poverty by absolute objective standards, it's great for being able to excuse me, benchmark and track progress, but it doesn't mean that we're necessarily understanding lived experience. And if we're not understanding real lived experience, if we're not understanding what it is that is genuinely valued by people, then it's another kind of principle-based vulnerability in the SDGs, because galvanizing action without that action being aligned to the things that genuinely matter to communities means that we can be doing well-intended, wrong-headed things. And I think to connect that back to the treaty conversation, one of the pieces of work we were really fortunate to work on a couple of years ago was a partner to the Living Standards Framework in New Zealand, which is, I think, still around on the Treasury website somewhere, called Aotearoa Waitangi. And in that piece of work, what we were looking at was how well-being would be articulated under a knowledge system based on Māori thought. And what came out of that conversation was a very different framing of the indicators. First, there was a consolidation of the ever-growing list of indicators out of the Stats NZ project, out of the Living Standards Framework. OECD. Whānau Ora has also got a huge number of indicators that are relevant. And I think the biggest insight out of that piece of work, well, there were two. One is that the same indicators are recycled regularly, but not necessarily for greater impact. And the second is that none of those indicators would have been an expression of well-being in a genuine sense, as understood by the pukenga Māori that we were working with. So I think you can kind of see the SDGs as just greater degrees of attenuation from originating points of principle. The SDGs take us one step further away from the principles that we are that we might want to privilege, and the indicators take us one step further. And if we use those 2 steps removed indicators to guide our action, then we're potentially going off in a direction that is less than helpful. And so that was my kind of big picture download on the SDGs. So now I'll actually come to the topic we were given. Briefly, because I've only got about 3 minutes left, which is about the treaty. And I think there are lots of organisations that are genuinely trying to give expression to the treaty. And if we look nationwide, there are a few different tools that we've got in the kete of how that relationship with Māori, those efforts to honour the treaty are given effect to. And the basic kind of tools are to appoint a Māori person or people to particular things. So we might create an advisory board, or we might put Māori on the governance entity, or we might create one or more roles for Māori inside the organisation. So that's one mechanism. The second mechanism that we typically do is we'll create some kind of partnership action plan with mana whenua. And that action plan typically has lots of powerful statements about the importance of the relationship, and then some not particularly well articulated actions to do. And we'll partner that tool with some kind of policy or strategy inside the organisation, and we'll follow all of that up with some training programs. And I think that those approaches are absolutely fair and valid. I'm also just not convinced that they're enough, because when we look at those tools, realistically, those tools have been used for 40 years. So we started having those kind of Māori appointments and those kind of policy solutions in the 1980s. We started having partnership agreements with mana whenua to become more common in the 1990s. So we've had quite some distance in terms of using these tools and recycling these tools. And there has been material and meaningful change, but I was born reasonably impatient. So I'm not sure that that is the best that we can do. But the best that we can do requires us ultimately to change. And as much as we might like, and particularly in this kind of community, advocates for change, in real terms, change is hard. Change means that we have to give up something. And so I think the most important conversation in these types of spaces is what can be given up by an organisation, and importantly, what will be given up by an organisation. Because last year, one of the disappointing almost secrets of New Zealand's making history about COVID is, for the first time in contemporary history, Māori had better social outcomes than non-Māori during the initial nationwide lockdown. And before we went into that lockdown, all reasonable forecasts were that Māori would have at least twice the infection and mortality rates of non-Māori. But actually, we had lower infection and mortality rates than non-Māori. And that is genuinely the first time in contemporary history that Māori have had better social outcomes than non-Māori. And I really love that story run on the front page of every newspaper because it is just enormously significant. And as much as we can be proud of the mainstream response to COVID, science-based lockdown, we can't attribute a mainstream policy with that rarest of positive outcomes for the Māori community. What we know is that for 180 years, mainstream policy has contributed to ever worsening disadvantage inside Māori communities. So it would be naive and optimistic to think that it was solely the mainstream response that enabled that outcome. What we can look to is a nationwide Māori response network that did what's the most visible part of that was the roadblocks, but that was only a small part of what the Māori response network was doing. There was a nationwide multi-channel response about distributing resources, distributing information, maintaining cultural connection and social connection that was really remarkable, that I think had a huge impact on achieving that historical milestone. And when we look at what that Māori response was comprised of, the most important part was that it was based on it is better to ask for forgiveness than permission. Māori communities mobilised and made things happen using their own resources because they knew they needed to look after their community. And I wanted to bring that example up, not just because I think that in every context we should be telling that story about Māori having better social outcomes than non-Māori, but because I think it potentially changes the nature of partnership and relationship conversations that we can and should have with Māori communities. Māori communities have assets and resources that might be intangible that other communities need. And I think that's really important to change our lens on what it is that Māori partners bring to the table. It's not just that we have a different way of thinking, it's that we have different channels into communities, we have social capital with communities that no one else can reach. Part of achieving what the SDGs aspire to, in my opinion, relies on Māori being a lead partner. So with that, I'll stop talking because I think I still managed to blow the time limit. And thank you for your time and attention. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe, Sasha. And despite going over time, I think you've provided not only a fantastic critique of the SDGs from your perspective, but also you've offered some thoughts for everyone to think about tonight, particularly around notions of partnership. I've seen some fantastic comments pop up in the chat, as well as a couple of questions. So hopefully we'll get time to ask you some of those questions that have popped up in the chat. But ngā mihi anō ki a koe, Sasha. Next, we're going to turn to Norm Hill from Ngāti Whakaia. Ngāti Whawhākia, Ngāti Noho, Ngāti Mahanga, and Norm has the position of being Māngai Māori on the Hamilton City Council with 23 years of environmental management experience at a marae, hapu and iwi level. Nā reira, kei te tuakana, tēnei rā aku mihi ki a koe, kei a koe hoki te wā.
Tēnā tātou, can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
I tēnei wā me tuku mihi ki te rungarawa, kia whakahone tō tātou nei kingi o tira ngā mate huhu o te wā, tātou te hunga ora, tēnei te mihi tēnā koutou katoa. My thinking is all over the place, and I'll do my best to have a really good yarn, and that's going to be my presentation. I wasn't quite sure if I'm going to land on the questions, but we're going to have a good yarn anyway. I did bring my guitar. I was going to try and take 2 minutes to take 2 minutes of my time by singing to give it that cultural flavour, but I won't do that. And I know I had Joe Wrigley in the background to back me up if I did need that anyway. Tēnā tātou katoa. I've come through Waikato Tānui's the tribal graduate program. I managed to get a tohu from university, and I'm now a māngai in various roles at the Hamilton City Council and others, really in a position to bring unity and collaboration together. Can I firstly, and I'll just watch the time too, because it's 8:52 on my laptop, but I just want to acknowledge Raewyn and Karen for mana wahinetanga, and I talk about leadership there, and she gave that presentation just recently, and I just want to acknowledge her because change is occurring here in Waikato. I'm proud to be involved in a movement of change, and the movement of change with regards to the SDGs is something that we as a community inclusive have not done before. However, Māori ourselves are doing it. If you look at the relevant strategies that iwi Māori have at a hapu marae iwi level, you've got strategy documents galore. If you go into Google and put cultural strategy, and these marae hapu strategies galore. So we actually have an SDG framework within the cultural context of our people. The key that I see now in regards to this movement of change is how do we connect the dots, and how do we unify and support our principles, our values, our mana motuhaketanga, tino rangatiratanga in achieving key outcomes for our people. And King Tawhio, our first Māori king, Te Whero Tawhio, he spoke about 7 generations. What we do now, we really need to reflect on what is the outcome going to be in 7 generations, and we're actually 7 generations now as a people. And yes, statistically, we know the data in regards to our well-being from a Māori Indigenous perspective. But one of the key opportunities that we have with this movement of inclusive change is the principle of inheritance, in my humble opinion. So from how do we take the principles of rangatahi tanga to rangatiratanga towards mana motuhake, mana whakahaere, tino rangatiratanga me era momo mea. So one of the roles I have, which is a māngai Māori, a voice for Māori at the Hamilton City Council, has never been done before. And we all know the movement that's happening across Aotearoa whānui in regards to Māori wards and other ways. And certainly it's not the silver bullet to achieve the overall holistic wellbeing targets that we want as a people. We know the baseline of those targets, and from a Waikato-centric point of view, we always reflect back to the whakatauki and the whakatauaki of yesteryear in terms of our King movement. And the baseline is for us from an environmental holistic point of view is represented in the Waikato River settlement, where King Tawhio said, "Toku awa koi ora me ona pikonga he kuratangi hi o te mātāmuri," the river of life at each bend more beautiful than the last. So how can we get a river that's full of life more beautiful than the last? It's kind of like an oxymoron, but we actually have a Māori baseline, a target that talks about our state of well-being or nehera. So in regards to that, from a SDG point of view, I'm proud to be a navigator, a manutaki, a supporter of a movement of inclusive change towards our goals that are achievable. And how do we, the key for us from a Waikato point of view and the role I have at the Hamilton City Council is how do we connect to the strategies and the realization of execution of outcomes and impact for our people in regards to taiao, hapori, hauora, whakapapa, mauri, mana, me era momo tangas. So how do we connect with our people with the relevant strategies and execution of those strategies towards outcomes, input, output, outcome impacts for betterment in regards to the movement of change here in Waikato. So I'm just watching the time, which is near closing for me, I think. In regards to the treaty, yesterday I sat in a meeting here in Kirikiriroa. We have a change happening for the first time in history, a Pou Manawa Ora Te Wellbeing document, a Māori wellbeing document. And I was really moved by the late lady Te Tiriti Moxon, where she focused on not the principles of the treaty, but the articles of the treaty, and used the articles as a foundation towards the indicators of well-being, but really pushing hard to ensure that to realise the treaty, it is about partnership, but to realise the treaty, it is about power sharing, is it about decision making, and is about being resourceful to enable and allow and assist and grow and achieve mana motu hake within the context of Aotearoa. So in conclusion, e ki ai te kōrero, ki te kotahi te kākahoka whati, ki te kapuia e kore e whati. When one reed stands alone, you're vulnerable, but when you're all bound tight, you can manage the elements of the wind, the rain, the storms, and unite as one and achieve those key outcomes as you desire. Tēnā tātou.
Tēnā koe, Norm. Just that last whakatauki, very well-known one from Waikato Tainui, and it makes me think of that collective impact that we have when we do work together. And as Sasha mentioned, we saw that with our nationwide Māori response to going into lockdown, and both of our speakers have made me think of back to the earthquakes here in Ōtautahi Christchurch, and in particular how Ngāi Tahu responded to that particular event, distributing resources, being resourceful, with this idea that it was going to be for the betterment of everyone, regardless of whether you were Ngāi Tahu or not. Nā reira, tēnei te mihi kia koe, Norm. Our final speaker for this panel is Moko Morris from Te Aitanga Māhaki and Te Aotearoa, who is the Sustainable Communities Coordinator with the Kapiti Coast District Council and co-chair of the Aotearoa New Zealand SDG stakeholder group. Nā reira, e te tuahine, ka tukuna atu te rākau kōrero ki a koe.
Tēnā koutou, nā nihu rei o te kaupapa ko te SDG, tēnā koutou. He mihi atu kia koe, Corbin, mō te manaakitanga i te pōnei, ki te whakapiri a mātou, koutou hoki ko Erika, ko Thomas, he uru tāku no te tairawhiti, no te Aitanga Māhaki, no te Aotearoa hoki, ko Moko Morris ahau. So when I first heard about the SDGs, I really grappled with how they could possibly impact or affect a small Māori village in Aotearoa in the South Pacific. And so I had to kind of locate myself in this. So firstly, I thought about my my immediate whānau that I care for and are committed to, and we look after each other and manage our whānau together. And then I thought about our extended whānau, how we are together, our hapu, wahia, and our wider connections. So I don't see that often, but closely connected through our heart and our tupuna. Then I have our iwi, who are wider still and more spread out, but we're still connected as well. So trying to work out where we sit in with this SDGs, and sharing values and commitment to whenua and iwi development. And then I thought about our Pacific cousins, who share our voyaging history, our language, and our whakapapa. And finally, then I thought about our whānau overseas, no Tawahi, our Indigenous brothers and sisters who share our struggles and our wairua nourishing traditions. And that's perhaps where I thought the SDGs might come into that conversation. But then that's also about manaakitanga and kotahitanga, which we do on a daily basis. So I guess it's about subscribing to a global framework, and what we do here affects an Indigenous person on the other side of the world. So that's where I thought it would fit in. So I thought about food. I thought about when you buy, say, for example, bananas, if you're buying fair trade bananas, coffee, tea, sugar, these tiny acts are the difference between sending Indigenous teenagers to university or not. And I met a young woman from Ecuador whose higher education hinged on people in developed countries like ours buying fair trade bananas. But then we think about the overall situation of Indigenous peoples worldwide, including Aotearoa. It can kind of be described as, excuse me, we're not really left behind, but rather pushed further behind. And this is mainly due to land grabbing, widespread human rights violations, and worsening inequality. And land grabbing still happens through public works acts here, so it's very much a threat today in our country. As Indigenous peoples globally, excluded and almost invisible in most SDG national action plans and strategies. And then we've got alarmingly 80% of biodiversity is protected by Indigenous people internationally, but only 10% of these territories have legal security. And so it doesn't paint a good picture around human rights. There's also, I think in 2019, at least 125 cases of political killings of Indigenous leaders occurred, mostly from defending land or organising people to defend land. So there's incredible lack of accountability, like Sasha said, and implementation of human rights violations and obligations, including failure to act on recommendations made by human rights advocates and organisations. So kia ora, Sasha, for bringing this up. So the SDGs are really simply a framework, that's all. And we must uphold the mana of Te Tiriti or Waitangi first. We constantly remind government as treaty partners that under Article 1, they have a duty and responsibility to protect Māori in pursuit of our rights to taonga, which in some of the work I do, it's around kai atua. We shouldn't have to remind the government, but that's our reality. A more recent example is the Organic Products Bill, which has been through Select Committee at the moment. And despite Māori through Te Waka Kaiora asking for the Treaty of Waitangi to be recognised in this, it wasn't. So there was, a bill before Parliament that had not one mention of the Treaty of Waitangi in this day and age. So it's not just historical injustices that are happening on a day-to-day basis, history. It's also, day-to-day breaches that are often quite blatant. I think the worst part of some of this work that we do in this space is that you often feel like you're complaining all the time, or you're checking words or documents and scanning the areas that could be improved, because as we know, language is so important. And then you kind of get triggered because you can't believe you're back in this boring space of having to maintain your ground and kind of explain yourself time and time again and offer advice that's mostly ignored, and it's tiring. One of the organisations I work with, Māori organisation, Te Puna Oranga, one of the thoughts we had was to employ a PA, a Pākehā advisor, to create a position around someone that could just deal with some of these things that we didn't have to deal with time and time again. So I think the process of decolonisation is essential to all of this. So Te Tiriti workshops, decolonisation workshops are particularly important to those agencies, especially those ones that hold all the perceived power. So a good way to look at it is, in the workplace, you often have to do first aid certificates, and these expire after maybe 2 years. So if you had to do treaty workshops or cultural competencies workshops through your local hapu, then you would move yourself along the journey. You wouldn't be stuck in a place where I've done an online course or I've done something, but you're revisiting that as your knowledge builds and your experience builds around it. You can keep that conversation going. It sounds kind of easy, but it's often not, because as you know, definitions of almost everything vary from culture to culture. So, I think the easiest and most logical way to honour the treaty and is to give funding and decision making back to Māori on the ground through Māori organisations and iwi and hapu. Thinking about the SDGs, and I guess I've gone off track too and haven't really dealt with the question. It's if you look at indicators. you could say something in front of them. So you could say, as a treaty partner, my expression of SDG involves te mea, te mea, te mea. I honour the treaty. I understand the treaty is the founding document of Aotearoa. Through SDG 12, we do this. In partnership with our local hapu, we value the role Te Tiriti has in Aotearoa, and this is how we express it. So, you don't have to be confined by the SDGs and their indicators. You can add something on that truly and genuinely represents where you're at and your commitment. Finally, I think I would like to end with a favourite saying from Eva Ricard, which was lead, follow, or get out of the way. And I feel that's where a lot of us on the ground are at right now. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe moko, o tira e mihi ana ki a koe me au kōrero. I was wondering for a moment what the PA was, and then when you followed up with Pākehā Advisor, I was, it's not quite what I was thinking, but yeah, it's fantastic. I could do with several of those to help me with some of my mahi. And I get the sense as well that there was a strong linkage there to that kōrero from Sasha as well around, we've been doing some of these same things for close to 40 years, and we're still seeing very little meaningful change in some ways. We've got time for a couple of questions, and I did see one from Brendan. So to everyone on the panel, feel free to jump in and answer this. So how do we all make the change? Believe we can make the change or become Indigenous? Would this be possible, plausible to change a worldview through an Indigenous framework? Any takers from our three panelists, Sasha, Moko, or Norm?
I can't see my mates, but that felt like the equivalent of an uncomfortable silence. But apologies to Norm and Moko if you did want to talk and you were just slow to your unmute button. I will quite happily stop talking. I'm just filling space. I think.
Oh, haere tonu.
Yeah, just for me, the beauty before the beast.
You're the high impact brother. So I think there's two responses to that. One is there's lots of people that are upping the ante on the demise of capitalism, and I'm not sure whether I believe that either, but I'd like to. And for those commentators that are talking about the demise of capitalism, or at least its significant moderation, they're talking about the rise in communitarian values and all of the types of things that are embedded in Indigenous worldviews. So I think it's really tempting to do the equivalent of the natives to the rescue. But there's a couple of really important caveats to that. First is we've got to save ourselves before we save the rest of the world. We've got really pressing and complex challenges in our own communities, and we're by nature generous, but there are limits to that generosity, and I'm not sure that we'd want that responsibility. I think when it comes to change, we do have to acknowledge that the values, the assumptions, the framing of problems and solutions that have got us to this point will not serve us to build solutions, which does mean that we need different values and different people to contribute to decision making. And that's where I think people have to give up something. People who are in comfortable positions of power have to give up some degree of power. People who are doing good work with good intent will still have the same experience of needing to make themselves uncomfortable to contemplate things they haven't contemplated before. And equally, when Māori go into non-Māori environments, we have to experience different forms of being uncomfortable as well. I think we've all got to learn how to be uncomfortable together and not step on each other's toes too much.
Tēnā koe, Sasha. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for any more questions, but I just really wanted to touch on the fact that we had a number of questions kind of framed around how does an individual or how do I as a Pākehā support or work in partnership with Māori communities at a hapu and iwi level. And I think Sasha actually, in a roundabout way, answered that in terms of, we've got to be prepared to give up a bit of power, but also have those uncomfortable and sometimes confrontational conversations and courageous conversations at that too, with the hope that, if we can level the playing field to a certain extent, i.e. be equally uncomfortable in an environment, we've got the possibility to be very creative in terms of how we achieve that change.